All right, I think we're going to get started. Is everyone having a good time?
Yeah.
All right. How come no one was up at 5 a.m. with me this morning? It was dead, the whole hotel. It was me and Deviant running around. All right, we're going to talk medical devices today. So real quick introductions. I'm Scott Erven. I'm Associate Director with Protiviti Consulting Firm. I focus solely on healthcare security, primarily with expertise in medical device security. I'm a security researcher, obviously, but I also come from the provider side as well. So I managed security programs inside of the healthcare system for over 5 years. So is anyone in here work for hospital or device manufacturing healthcare? Okay, quite a few. Awesome. Anyone else been to a hospital before? Yeah, okay, a few more. Good. So spent just over 3 years, about 3.5 now, researching medical device security. So that's my Twitter handle. If you want to hit me up, I'll let Mark introduce himself quick.
Thanks. My name is Mark Collao. I'm a security consultant with NeoHapsis, a Cisco company. Pen tester by trade. I've been doing that for the past 5 years. It's been my only job. Researcher as well, just like Scott. Primarily mostly in AppSec, and I do enjoy Honeypots. Been running Honeypots for the past 3-4 years, whether it be web front end or network based. So there's my Twitter handle as well. If you want to talk Honeypots or AppSec or anything, just hit me up.
All right, so really quick, what we're going to cover. First, kind of, why do we research medical devices? Why are we looking at that area? Why does it matter to us? And then second, phase one research. Just a quick recap of stuff that started, like I said, like 3 years ago, general classes of, vulnerabilities that we see across devices. And then brief recap on phase two, which I talked about in quite a bit of depth last year at Derbycon, if anyone came to my talk, which was internet exposure of medical devices and healthcare organizations that had misconfigurations that allowed direct attack vectors into their medical device systems. And then phase three, this is how do you get admin access to these devices now that we know they're connected, now that we know they're exposed in some cases to the internet. How would an attacker go about getting admin access? And so we'll talk about that. That's some of the newer stuff. And then Mark's going to spend some time on honeypot research of, okay, now we know we can get into these systems. Are attacks really happening, intentional or otherwise unintentional? Finally, kind of diagnosis, treatment plans. Kind of an update on, what we're seeing in the space over the last year. Has it gotten better? Is it getting worse? Those types of things. So first, there's kind of that, why do we get into it, right? And there's that personal impact that most of us have. Either, some of us may be reliant on that, whether a diabetic, have a pump, those types of things, or have a close family member, may have an implantable pacemaker, stimulator, something like that. Outside of that, for me, it wasn't just even that personal impact, but like I said, I worked in healthcare. And as I've seen these devices become more connected, that's kind of where I got a passion. It was, I don't want to say I don't care about patient privacy. Obviously, I care about patient privacy. It's important. But as these devices started to become connected, I seen actual, not only could your data get stolen, but there's potential, adverse patient safety issues that are much more important to me than patient privacy. And I think if we look at it through that lens, we can kind of encompass a lot of those privacy aspects by building security, in the engineering and design phases of these devices. So that's kind of why we're in it. Also, just want to set the stage real quick, because oftentimes, like, I get through the talk, and then the first question is, who's crazy enough? Who would do that? Why would somebody do that? And so it's important to note that, malicious intent's not a prerequisite for like an adverse patient safety event. And so a story here is there was two individuals at a hospital in Austria, and they presented for gunshot wounds. They were hooked up to an infusion pump, and it was a PCA model, which is the patient controlled administration. So that's the little clicker button model pump that you get. Well, they didn't feel their pain management was under control. The nursing staff, clearly, they felt otherwise. Yeah, you're doing fine. Well, these guys decided, we're just going to go online. We're going to find the service, the technician, the documentation from the manufacturer, got the credentials, the hard-coded credentials, went into the system, upped their limits, and suffered like OD effects over the next couple of days, and built up a tolerance to morphine. So that's something to prove that, security can cause an adverse event, even though it's not malicious, or even it may not even be an attacker. It could be a patient itself. So think of that frame of mind, that it doesn't necessarily have to be intentional and malicious to cause an event. Obviously, that's a reality. It can happen. But it's not the only way. So I think that's a good, segue into, how good medical device security is in general. If you're on morphine and you can figure out still how to hack your own pump, it's probably not very good. So what are we doing, right? Discovering those patient safety issues, like I said, not necessarily focused on privacy. A lot of it encompasses privacy. There are some things in here that are more privacy focused that I'll point out and show how they potentially relate to patient safety as well. Alerting affected parties, working and coordinating with providers, the actual medical device manufacturers and disclosure, ICS CERT, FDA. Those agencies have been pretty heavily involved, especially over the last 12 months with us. And then just, public awareness, speaking at conferences here, obviously the InfoSec community on some of the more technical aspects, but then speaking a little bit higher level on how do you actually resolve some of these things, outside of the InfoSec community, more in the healthcare space, and higher level, healthcare administration folks as well. So phase one, what do we kind of see? What are these, general categories that we see? This is, the big three across all the devices you look at. And this is, when you look across all the various different modalities. So whether that's implantables or whether that's, radiology equipment, whether that's infusion systems, those types of things, kind of across the board, this is what you see. You see a problem with weak, either default or hard-coded administrative credentials, which we're going to show you here when we get a little bit later. Known software vulnerabilities that exist. There are old devices. So those of you that raised your hand that said you were in healthcare, raise your hand if you don't have a system, the XP that's on the network. Exactly. There's one that kind of raised his hand. He's kind of lying. He has 2000. He doesn't have an XP. No, I'm just kidding. What's that? Oh, yeah. There are some of those, too, where you get some of the newer hospitals that are getting stood up in clinics, and it's, they get to start from scratch, so they don't have the XP. They got all the latest. But, yeah, other than that, it's the reality, right? These devices are legacy. They're not getting updated. They're not getting patched. Third, unencrypted data. You might first think, well, that's, a patient privacy thing. And it absolutely is. With all these interfaces, with all this data exchange between these devices, medical device integration coming online and pumping, either, pumping data for alerting purposes or pumping data into the medical record so that the physicians have that data in near real time. How those systems often work is through that medical device integration product, it uses a web server. So it talks from the device, it converts the proprietary protocol over serial, over to Ethernet, and then pumps it to a web server. Well, it just pumps it through like an XML file and completely unencrypted just over HTTP. So you can sit in there and you can intercept that, or you could replay it, or you just set post requests to it, it accepts it, and ultimately it ends up in the medical record as false data. And so, yes, it's a privacy thing, because your data could be stolen or sniffed. But it's also, if it ends up in the medical record, inaccurate data, those types of things, it would be similar to medical identity theft where someone presents as you for treatment, and there's a lot of research that's been done on effects of misdiagnosis, mistreatment, being prescribed the wrong drug, medication, etc. So phase two, so those are some of the high-level devices. And I worked with another researcher, Sean Merdinger, and we did a big talk on this last year at DEF CON, and then I gave a talk here at Derbycon, so this is just kind of a recap. But are these devices now, exposed to the internet? Because many healthcare providers said, well, we understand that there's issues, but these things are segmented. And they're on the internal network, and you can't ever get to them. Well, I worked in healthcare, I know better, and I know we have to open it up more and more for that integration with the medical record. So we went out to look at that. And we did find many devices. So if you watch one of our previous talks, like radiology equipment, so X-ray, CT scanners, PACS systems, linear accelerator devices, external defibrillators, those types of things were direct on net. But what we also found when we were doing that research is we used Shodan, and we were doing a search for anesthesia. And I got a hit that came back like on anesthesia. And I knew that it wasn't a medical device, right? I know what those banners look like for the most part. I've been looking at them for years. The only indication that it was a medical device is that it was running XP. But other than that, there wasn't any indication that it was a medical device. And I said, what's going on here? And it's dumping all of these systems. And I realized that it was a misconfiguration on this healthcare organization's external system, and they had SMB open with anonymous read and stuff all the way to AD. So it was extracting all this information about their entire network, not just medical devices. And so the first one we came across was very large, over 12,000 employees, over 3,000 physicians, and it had intelligence on almost 70,000 of their internal systems. So this is everything from what the host name was, what the system does. If it was, it would be very detailed to this was the anesthesia card in OR7 of this wing of the hospital. Or it was on this floor. It was this physician's system. It didn't have a lockout or timeout exemption. There was also third-party organizations that were in that data set. So organizations that I know and people in healthcare know, when you see them, they're associated to third party for like lab reading services or radiology reading services. Those type of organizations were in the data set, their systems, and information was in there as well. So did we find just that one? No, we found hundreds. So we just did Showdown here. You can see we're just looking at SMB and looking at org names to see what's set and what has that anonymous read through. And those are the returns for common org names, so like health, clinic, hospital. Once you started changing those and went into like specialty clinics, so if you started doing searches for like radiology or podiatry or pediatric, then we ended up with like thousands of organizations that had this misconfiguration and direct attack vector. This is a summary of the devices just inside that one organization of the thousands. And so you can see here, anesthesia systems, cardiology, infusion systems and pumps. MRI systems, PAC systems is interesting. There's not really data on this that I can support that with, but I think they're a very soft target. They have a lot of PHI. I think a lot of the attacks that are taking place are getting into PAC systems. What PACS is basically you're archiving storage for any of your radiology devices. So whether it's an X-ray, whether it's a CT, whether it's an MRI, once those images are processed, then they're stored into the PAC system for retrieval and reading. They don't have very good authentication, and I have some examples in here when we get to phase 3 in a little bit. But on the front end, when you go in through the application, most of them, for example, will require authentication. So you'll have to put in a unique username and password to get into the application. But all that's doing is calling to backend storage. Well, that backend storage, if you actually look at the documentation and the implementation of these, and then you test them like I do, you find out that most of them don't have even NTFS permission set up on the backend, so you can just walk into the IP, into the network, and grab all of these files that are sitting there. There's a couple that actually have credentials, and we'll talk about those. In case I'm going to show you they actually have credentials, unfortunately, they're fairly poor. So we're just going to talk about some of the attacks that are possible with that external facing system with SMB, the type of information that we had.
Thanks. Yeah, so right now we're going to put our bad guy hats on, and if you think the information that Scott just went over, anything that's leaked through Showdown, so you got GeoIP, anything that's leaked through read-only access to the AD or that's leaked over SMB. You have information about the IP, the host name, and all that, and possibly even the username of who's using the computer. So the first attack vector would be physical. We know where the hospital or healthcare center is, or university healthcare system. We know the system. We know the floor and office number because we can get that information through the anonymous read through SMB, and from there we can also extract a lot of information of their security lockout process, or possibly the length of passwords. So how many people have been in a hospital where they just slap on a guest badge on you and you can walk out wherever you want, and it doesn't matter which floor. So prepare yourself with that information: what office number, what floor, what the username is, what the host in the computer. You wait till that doctor's not there, and you can just wreak havoc. It's a minimum 8-character password. Odds are the doctor will probably have an 8-character password just because they like things quickly, and no lockout exemption, and then you just keep trying. So you have physical access, and obviously you can do other attack vectors. If you have USB rubber ducky or anything, you can just pop in a USB to kind of extract information from there. And of course you have phishing. So again, you have information, who it is, what type of OS it is, and all this other stuff, and you can easily craft an email and just send it to the guy or the doctor or whoever knows that might have access to that system that you gain from OSINT. And in that payload, you can it can be an exe, or it can be Excel payload, anything that obviously will cause a machine to run. And again, these machines are all running XPSP2, or possibly you can use that as leverage to get to the system from their system and odds are these probably don't have antivirus due to the fact that they have to, are critical systems. And then you have the pivot. So there's also 0867 that we know from Shodan, and obviously there's, exploiting 0867 is pretty trivial nowadays, using Metasploit, so you can easily just pop a shell on it and get interpreter, and from there you can start your pivoting techniques like any other attacker would. So you can start scanning through that system or run exfiltration to that system. And also, you can also create another custom payload to target those specific systems only, so you're not infecting, obviously, the whole hospital floor. You can keep the isolation pretty secure.
All right, so now we know we got systems that have some of these issues. They've got network connectivity. Some of them have exposure to the internet, some by design, based on documentation, others unintentionally through misconfigurations, their organizations exposed and allowing direct attack vectors into these devices. So thirdly, kind of what does it take to get, administrative access on these devices? A lot of that quick question.
Yeah. You said they use proprietary protocols. You just talked about
Some do.
OSI stuff.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, proprietary, just like proprietary crypto, right? Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Most of them, they're just typical network stacks. Some of them, what I was saying with the integration, the ones that are like the proprietary protocols are on some of the systems that weren't built for, that don't have like Ethernet or Wi-Fi on them. So like anesthesia carts, things like that only have a serial adapter. So they built like the serial conversion from the serial to Ethernet, and that has a proprietary like driver protocol to do the information exchange, but it ultimately then throws it back on the wire through a web server. Yeah. And then a lot of them is like web access. They're just running on non-standard ports. They're not running on 80. They're running on 9070 or something that you find. So how hard is it to get admin access? This is the disclosure, just to go through the disclosure timeline, and also here you'll know who the vendor is. So it's GD Healthcare. So it was last August when we went through this documentation and found default or hard-coded credentials inside of the documentation for some of their products that we'll cover here today. In September, after that first disclosure, had a little bit more time, went through some more, and so disclosed like another 30 sets of credentials. First disclosure was around 100 sets of administrative credentials. And in December, ICS CERT came back and said that GE had finished their investigation and that they were closing it. So I did choose to disclose it just because of the sheer bulk of the information, and it is medical devices, and I want to do the right thing. But I think it's also important to note that all this information was actually publicly available already and has been sitting out on GE's website under documentation. So what was the response like from the the researcher aspect? Well, GE, even though they're an example here, they're actually one of the more progressive medical device manufacturers out there when it comes to developing an internal security team and product security. We could go probably every single manufacturer and do the same talk, right? So don't think that GE's poor. GE is actually one of the better ones, and working with them in the disclosure is one of the easiest ones out there. One of the top 3 or 4 to work with. So don't think that that was negative or anything. They responded very quickly. They worked through it. Their formal answer, just so we have that out there, is that after their investigation, they determined that all of these credentials were default and they were not hard-coded. So that's their official response to the investigation. I'll show later some what I think are a little bit, some contradictions to that statement, but this is their statement. All right. So here we go. We go slide share. We're going to go fast because there's a lot of them. So I thought it was really cool. Like, hey, it's going to be awesome. Like, drop 30 CVs in a talk. And it was like, oh, that's a lot of slides and a lot of info. So just to give you a background here. Up top is the CVE identifier, which you should all be familiar with. The first thing you might notice is, hey, what's going on, Scott? That says 2006. Have you been hoarding this thing for the last 9 years? No, I haven't. As I said, this information was publicly available. So how CVE works in that disclosure is when you find it, we go back to the earliest iteration of that documentation that we could find publicly accessible, and then we retrospectively assign a CVE identifier to it. So that's why it's 2006. What's of interest when we're going through these to look, though, is You may say, oh, well, is this a problem just with legacy systems or newer systems? I did systems from 2000, knowing that systems older than 2000 are definitely in, but I did in healthcare environments. So I did 2000 to present. And so that's the identifier, and then the CVSS score that was assigned, every one of them's a 10. And then you can see here, manufacturer, make, the type of account, login info. So here's one, 2013. So you can see that was in 2013, so that's a little newer. So it's not just legacy systems. We're getting into some new ones. There's some remote, telnet, FTP admin, user IDs and passwords for nuke imaging system. More nuke imaging stuff, telnet, FTP. You see this one was 2013, 2003, so it's a 10-year difference, still the same issues. Nuke imaging system, here we get into SU accounts. So that's interesting, obviously. Root accounts, service accounts, remote access, full admin access, drop into shell. Service login, Acceleris. The other interesting is like looking at the passwords, so like that, like Pwnage one, across product lines, across multiple like spans of years, and seeing how they switched products and were reused. And we didn't really learn from previously failed practices, continue to do them in some cases. More nuke imaging, you can see we get into some local Windows admin. On the bottom there, WinVNC login. So you see WinVNC used. You see, I think I got another example in documentation later of like PC Anywhere is being used for support. I've seen linear accelerator technology in their documentation that in the documentation says put this outside of your DMZ and open in any rule for support purposes. So in documentation, yeah. Not GE, different. Nuke imaging systems, we'll keep going here. Get through these. It's a lot. More SU logins. There's big guy again in 2010. He shows up in a CT scanner. More admin logins for cardiology systems. So this is getting into cardiology, centricity, and then we'll start getting into like the PACS imaging stores that I was telling you about. These are all radiology systems, by the way. More cardiology. Here's the image vault. So centricity, storing those images. There's the super awesome password for the SA account of none, and other shared credentials that are utilized for admin access to this. So this is where all of that back-end data storage is taking place, is in the image vault. So it's treasure troves of PHI sitting there. Here's the archive audit trail. So this is 2014, so this is a new one. So there's a couple interesting things here, right? So first we see, okay, well, SSL, key manager and key store. So they've learned some things, right? We're doing some good things here. We're like, oh, right, we're actually going to offer the ability to encrypt some traffic. However, if you want the keys, then here's the weak password to go and get them. We didn't, fix that. We still kept that failed practice, but at least we're seeing, some progress here of, hey, there's the ability to encrypt, this communication. So that's a positive. And these things don't happen overnight. So like I said, GE is one of the better ones, one of the more progressive, really leaders, in the security space, with the device manufacturers. But what they're doing now, you're not going to see for 3, 4, 5 years at least, just for the development life cycle of these devices. If you get into organizations doing implantables, even not an expedited approval, there was an expedited approval that came through for an implantable underarm like ICD, because you didn't have to open chest cavity. So from an infection prevention standpoint, it was a game changer. It just had to go underarm, under skin, and they would run a lead. That was on an expedited approval. It took 12 years before it made it to market. So they do take time. Analytics servers, SQL, centricity PACS. Here's SQL SA logins for that PACS systems. And more PACS systems. And here's that back-end storage and servers. So for the NAS, if you want read-only, just use RO. If you want read-write, just change it to RW and you have read-write access. Some more and more. Here we get into some web services, some of that IIS interfaces that I was telling you about that do a lot of like the image transfer. This is the PACS system. So that's the web login, just IIS. Gamma cameras, more CT scanners, big guy for the win. Oh, more big guys. He's all over the place. This one's interesting. So this is the last one. But this was the service tech logins. So they had batch files that would create scripts. So if you wanted to create service tech logins, you could just run this batch script with the admin account once you had access, and then it would create you these 2 accounts with elevated privileges and that password. And the rest of them down there, like, that's how you create actual user accounts, X-ray technician accounts, like 1 through 100, with the password of X-ray tech. So what better way to visualize all this and put it all together, all of these usernames and passwords to see reuse over all of, GE Healthcare's like product lines on the radiology side than, to put it all into a word cloud. So that's what we did. So this is the word cloud representation of all the user IDs and passwords that we just showed you, which was over like 130 sets of credentials, which resulted in about 30 CVEs. One thing you'll notice, obviously, the big guy is reused. But when I was putting it into the word cloud websites, you'll notice that this isn't technically accurate if you paid attention, because the passwords are actually like #big guy or #big guy1, right? Well, apparently, application security on word cloud websites is much better, and it actually strips out special characters for input. Yeah, so it stripped it out. I couldn't find a single word cloud site that would allow a leading pound sign, and so it's not 100% accurate, but it gives you a good idea, good visual representation there. So, if they're indeed default, are there still issues? So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to show some cases. Documentation in some cases, it instructs, don't change these. Don't ever allow a password reset. Some cases, the documentation instructs, don't change your password or we will not be able to support you. Documentation isn't updated on how to change the default credentials. Secure configuration guides are lacking. In many cases, I do agree with GE. There are in here and in their documentation where it is default, it's definitely not hard-coded. But there's these other cases where I'll show you some of the discrepancies that I don't think it's well outlined, and it's contradictive to something that would be a default credential. And support personnel and integrators, they use this documentation when they go on site to install it. So it's rampant across the environment that they use these credentials that are shared. I would say 75%, 80% of the time when I go in, I'm in with these types of credentials on the systems because they aren't changed. So here's an example. So user cannot change password. Check that. Check password never expires. That's typically not something I would instruct you to do if I was telling you that was a default password and should be treated as a default password and changed. Changing passwords 3.3.2 down on the bottom here. Important. Again, important note to you, provider. Do not change this password. Remote access will be disabled for support if the password's changed. So is a healthcare organization going to ignore your important warning on top of just a regular don't change it? Or are they going to leave it as it is? I don't know. You decide. Again, in bold and an exclamation point. Do not change this password. So here's the password, and then we see this note. Tech support will log into the system with PC Anywhere using this username and password. So that's where we see remote access through PC Anywhere. I already showed you VNC. And for those physicians, since they love to type in passwords, they would never use this, but if they wanted to, they could hit yes and not have to enter in their credentials again. Ask a remote operator for your assigned username and password. So they call that a way for support. We in this room call that a backdoor. They obviously have constant access to that system and can give you a login at any time. And we'll reset that password to password. So this last one here, before Mark talks about honeypots really quick, is this is an example of, I want to show you like kind of thinking, like as a researcher or as an attacker, how you kind of lay out, your research to see where potentially issues could exist in a device that could cause, harm or an adverse, like patient safety event. So this is not an actual one. I haven't done anything on this system. So I'm using this as a theoretical example to show you how I think about it and go about finding issues. So for this documentation, you can see, note, in order, to perform the following steps, you must generate X-ray radiation and follow proper safety precautions. So that's stuff we'll look through. We'll look for like these warnings, like if you mess with this config, it could cause an issue, be careful. Well, as an attacker or as a researcher, that means, well, those parameters, probably not good validation checking in there, and can you do something that's not intended or not under intentional use? So that's what this is with the X-ray system, is you would look at that and you would say, okay, You go in with these logins and you perform this and you monitor it and you see how it goes. By design, it's probably for calibration, clearly, right? So it's going to be low-level dosing. Dosing is what matters in radiology when it comes to like safety, patient safety issues or adverse events. So you can go ahead, log in, see what's going on there. Well, once you get that, can you replay that? Can you replay that then at a higher dosing level than like the intended dosing level? Through the application, it may not allow it. It may have a safety stop. But on the back end, if you just pass it, are those controls and checks in place? And so this is the type of thing we look at when we're doing research and kind of laying that out. And lastly, documentation. This is contradictory to me. There's a warning in documentation that says adhere strictly to procedures in this manual. And then overall on the documentation website, it says the editors and producers of G documentation claim no responsibility for the accuracy of it. So adhere strictly to it, but we don't claim any responsibility for accuracy. So I think that's a little contradictive as well. All right, so Mark's going to talk here on honeypots real quick.
Cool. All right, so Scott explained all these attacks and all these different attack vectors, these default passwords, these web front ends that might be flawed, and maybe even allow for SQL injection for an external attacker to log in and wreak some havoc. So, other than obviously injecting ourselves between the medical devices and the internet, which is going to be a really hard thing to do, why not just create honeypots and see if anybody's actually exploiting this and looking for these type of attacks? So, what are we looking for? So, the default login information for remote access, pound big guy or any other default credentials, leveraging existing exploits, so replicating MS-0867, exposing it to the internet, replicating, possibly some vulnerable VNC or telnet. Custom malware, are these attackers actually making custom malware that's specifically designed for these devices? Could be MRI machines, could be infusion pumps, anything that we're exposing the internet. And are they doing malicious intent to interfere with the device? So once an attacker, or if an attacker gets a hold of the device, what are they doing? Are they just doing, some proper, or just enumerating the system? Or are they actually looking to execute certain commands that only by looking through the documentation, can increase the dosage or possibly, emit radiation like the calibration feature? And are there campaigns against specific vendor devices? So obviously diversify the type of honeypots we're going to put. Obviously, they're coming from different vendors or they're part of different software, and see if there's specific attacks that are going for these honeypots. All right, so the setup. So obviously, we're trying to mimic the device external presence to a T, so collecting a lot of the stuff from Shodan and from documentation of how things should respond when receiving certain packets, down to the type of SSH version it uses, or, HTTP headers and different protocols that are exposed. Like I mentioned earlier, replace existing vulnerabilities. So OSK7, Telnet Remote Command Execution, VNC, the default credentials for the SSH and web. That also includes, replicating the SQL injection or maybe, XXC that could be on the vulnerable web application. And also copy file structure attributes. So it's a huge pain, but we had to, figure out what type of file system, what type of OS is on the back end, and, really replicate it. So once an attacker does gain access to this, it's not just like setting up a simple Kippo SSH honeypot, that's actually, real binaries, real errors, real everything, but obviously you have to jail them to that system. Also, on a side note, if anybody knows how to replicate Windows XP2 or XP SP2 in Python, that'd be really great. So the biggest problem we had setting this up was like, how do I get XP SP2 honeypot set up? My solution was to just have it snapshot every 10 minutes while it logs to an external server. So if anyone knows of a Python way to do it or anything else, please let me know, because that was a pain in the ass. Also, exposing 0867 to the internet gets you owned in about 2 minutes. So internet presence, so getting the word out. So Shodan, obviously Google-friendly searches, but we have to really rely on the Google bots and Shodan's agents or whatever to come and pick and scan our subnet we're on or our host to pick it up and put in information so people can come look at it. I mean, we're not exactly on a time crunch, but I mean, we wanted to kind of speed up this research. So releasing CVEs and public disclosing vulnerabilities. So with Scott's research and previous medical device research, there are vulnerabilities in CVEs out there with default passwords or possibly known medical devices with known exploitations or POCs out there. So we obviously picked those to kind of like make an attacker be like, all right, like this is this is going to be definitely exploitable. Also, mimicking a known device dump to pastebin in Twitter with unique hunting credentials. So another unique way to kind of speed up attacks is that we would post kind of fake medical device hacking dumps out in pastebin, or create a fake Twitter, be like hacked by some team, blah blah blah, and say these are default creds or default passwords, or this vulnerability exists on these devices, and we got hacked, or to kind of like see if anybody's scanning on Twitter, or anybody that has like a password scraper on pastebin that will hopefully pick these up and maybe possibly spread them to some other hacking groups or hacking teams that will hopefully look like, okay, this is a medical device, we should probably go after this and see if we can do any harm. All right, so the data. So across 10 honeypots, and out of those successful logins, there's about 55,416. That's including web logins with default passwords, SSH with default passwords. 24 successful exploits. So majority of those were MSO867, but that also includes either vulnerable VNC, Telnet, or even some vulnerable SSH versions. Almost 300 dropped malware samples. And the top 3 source countries was pretty interesting. Number 1 being the Netherlands, China, and Korea. The latter two, you can kind of make your educated guess on why it could be. But what's interesting is the Netherlands, which we're actually still trying to investigate. But that's definitely, an interesting point to make, that why is traffic coming from the Netherlands to these specific honeypots. So, so I mean, you can, you can deduct it to either somebody's VPNing there, or there was like a compromised, subnet or something, or data center. But so Honeycred's logins. So this is particularly more interesting because these Honeycred logins are part of like our Twitter dumps and our pastebin dumps, and those are unique to our honeypot samples, which there are only 10 in the world. So obviously, somebody picked it up, somebody saw this, somebody made the correlation between username, password, and login, and whatever the device is, and logged into our device. So seeing these, very excited. And what did the attacker do once he got in? Nothing. So, sad face there. It was, for those who have, played with honeypots before and see, it's usual traffic. You get owned, your gets compromised in some way. They come in, they do some enumeration, and they maybe drop a payload file for persistence, or connect you up to an IRC C2 command server. So, did they realize they had a root in an MRI machine? No. If they did a little more enumeration, or if it was an actual human behind those, typing those commands, checking the uname, checking the host name, it's pretty easy to tell, like, this is not your everyday crappy Linux machine on the internet. So we can deduct from that, are their own medical devices calling back to C2? Yes. So that's pretty scary, knowing that all these devices, these PAC systems, these MRI machines, DFibs are connected to the internet. We emulated those to a T. Obviously, we haven't tried dropping an IRC bot on an MRI machine, but we can, deduct that there are owned medical devices calling back somewhere to C2, and there's a bot operator out there with these machines there, and they don't know what type of information they're sitting on. So whether it be through, a big news event, news exposure, or, if there was another, like, more publicly released, medical device story or something that kind of catches the attention, and realize attackers are like, okay, we can actually use this for harm, or we can use this to for extortion, or if there's any, like, very important people out there, and they kind of have more background information through the OSINT back when we were talking about Shodan, they can take advantage of that and really target attacks for malicious use. So conclusion. So have we seen evidence of intentional targeted attacks? Not yet. But are these devices being compromised through unintentional attacks? Absolutely. So like I just mentioned earlier, these devices are getting owned repeatedly. And I mean, now that more hospitals and more devices are, either Wi-Fi enabled or connected via Ethernet and no longer have to support really, arcane or custom protocols, people are just plugging them into the internet or connecting to some hotspot as they travel around, the Starbucks or something, and it's, pretty prevalent. And, just knowing that next time you're in a hospital and you're getting hooked up to some machine and you see that Ethernet going to the wall, I mean, it kind of makes you think twice. Like, is this connected to a command and control server somewhere, and somebody can just DDoS this machine that I'm connected on? So, very scary stuff.
Right. So finally, kind of just general like diagnosis, situational stuff. What's going on, kind of with the medical device security space in general over the last year, where we're headed. So we know there's exposed vulnerable systems, right? And all software has flaws. The connectivity increases that interaction. So these devices are on the network. They're in a hostile environment. So they're essentially, software-driven, connected. They're vulnerable and exposed. There's that lack of patient safety alignment, I think, in the medical device security side. So healthcare organizations, we got all our funding for security for the most part when you look at the provider side from HIPAA, from PHI. And so programs have been built around that. That's kind of compliance, regulatory compliance. It's not a security program or a framework to implement. And patient privacy has kind of overridden and driven that. I think if we switch that to patient safety, we're going to be much more effective, and a lot of those privacy things and those security controls that are in place are going to roll up into that. Gotcha. So talked about the first two, but number three, this is important to understand. The FDA does a lot, but do understand that the FDA does not validate any type of safety or security controls inside the devices. They do not do it. It is not a requirement currently for the manufacturer. And malicious intent is not a prerequisite for adverse patient safety outcomes. So what can we do? Well, one, scan your devices. You can do that. Many organizations are starting to do that over the last few years, running vuln scanning against systems. Obviously, you're not going to run denial of service stuff against production systems and certain really heavy checking controls, but many organizations are doing traditional vulnerability scanning against these types of devices. So do that scan, look for these default creds in your network, report them to the manufacturer, work with them to get them resolved. Falls to us, right? Patient safety is not a spectator sport. So if you work in healthcare, get involved. It does matter. It goes right to your healthcare organization's mission and values. Patient safety, quality care is going to be in every healthcare organization's mission, values, core beliefs, those types of things. It's a multi-stakeholder environment. The information security people aren't going to do it themselves. So when I was doing this, and then now as a consultant, when I do this, it's information security, it's biomedical engineering, it's even getting into procurement and contracting language and what type of security controls and, financial penalties, clauses can you get in up front to require certain things, like perhaps having a manufacturer have a way for you to report a vulnerability to them and how quickly they'll respond and release a patch. Having that in the contract is something that you can work with in here, but those are stakeholders you need to get involved in, then with procurement, with legal, all those groups. So it's not just, you can't do it by yourself. It's really an organizational, multi-stakeholder environment in order to get this fixed. So if we continue as is, right, the FDA, right now, they receive several 100,000 reports of patient safety issues a year. And this is related to adverse events from a medical device malfunction. The issue is, we say, well, there's no evidence that an attack has happened on these devices. I like to say we have low assurance that something hasn't happened. Not saying intentional, not saying unintentional. I'm just saying you can't prove or disprove something if your device lacks evidence capture and you don't have forensics trails. And that's the situation we're in with most of these devices right now. So what can we do? We talked about most of these. Avoiding failed practices, right? We don't always know what the best solution forward is, but we know what's failed. We know hard-coded credentials are bad. We need to stop. We need to do something better. We may not get it right, but at least we're not knowingly doing bad things over and over continually. So we need to learn from those, failed practices and really avoid them. If we do that, we're going to get those devices to market without delay, without that additional cost. It's going to be cheaper to engineer it up front than deal with it after. we're going to have better collaboration amongst allies. We're already doing that. We have a lot of the stakeholders now. Researchers are being invited in to work with manufacturers at the table with regulatory agencies, so the FDA. I've been out and met with HHS folks. So they're very open door. They want to hear it. They're interested in hearing about what we can bring to the table as, security researchers and how to help them solve problems. This is kind of quick, just as we wrap up, kind of highlights over the last 12 months, right? What we've seen in the space. And before this, it was very minimal. And last October, November, it was October, the FDA held its first ever medical device security workshop. And so they opened that up, and there was a couple thousand people that ended up either coming in person or attending through online through the webinar. So that was the first time that had taken place. They released pre-market submission guidance for security, for cybersecurity, and they released that right before the actual workshop took place. And so many healthcare organizations, I talk to them, and they say, oh, well, we didn't ever look at that pre-market manufacturer guidance because it's for the manufacturer. Well, yes, it's what the FDA is telling the manufacturer what they should do. So you as a provider can then take that and say, oh, well, since the FDA is asking them to do that, we should be asking them to do that during contracting, that they have these types of things in place and we're actually are validating and ensuring that they're in place. So that's how you can kind of use that to leverage. IEEE workshop was a building code for secure medical device software that took place with IEEE, George Washington University in November as a part of. Vulnerability disclosure policies. This is a big one. Just over a year ago at my talk last year at DEF CON, we announced the first medical device manufacturer, which was Philips, had agreed to come up with a coordinated disclosure policy. So they actually were the first to actually get it out the door, and that happened last November. So they finally got coordinated disclosure policy out on their website. Medtronic, although they don't have a full formal disclosure policy now, they do have off their main website a security reporting mechanism to send in a special mailbox and all of that to handle these inbound reports. And then recently, at B-Sides Las Vegas, with the cavalry side, Draeger Medical, which is a European based out of Germany, they released a coordinated disclosure policy as well. So big improvements. We're starting to get there. We're starting to have those conversations. Another big one was the FDA, about a month and a half ago maybe, released a safety advisory, some research that Billy Barrios had done, another researcher in the medical device space, on Hospira pumps, and advised healthcare organizations to stop using these devices. Now, this is a safety alert that came out, and it's important to note that it came out before evidence of harm, before there was actual evidence that something took place. And if you know the FDA, usually they're not recalling products until people have been proven to die or have serious side effects. So this was massive. They have been at the table. The FDA has been awesome to deal with over the last 12 months. Talked to them on multiple occasions, multiple times a month with that group. So I know they have lots of other problems that are actually definitely with evidence killing people right now to worry about, and they have this on their plate. So it is important, and I feel the last year that they've done an incredible job. So how to get involved? Acquiring medical devices, eBay, MedWow, there's third-party sites, those types of things. Get involved in industry working groups. So there's a few of them out there. MDIS is one that's kind of on the medical device security space. You speak on the topic, whether that's industry conferences, not necessarily security conferences, but just general healthcare, HIMSS, those types of events that actually get in front of the decision makers for healthcare organizations. And finally, if you haven't gone down to the Cavalry Room, I think it's done now, but the last couple of days, if you haven't checked out Eye on the Cavalry, they're kind of a grassroots research organization that are looking at the intersection of internet or network connected devices and public safety. So medical devices is kind of one of their cornerstone. Work with a lot of those guys down there, so check them out as well. And we're done, but if you have any questions, we'll jump around out back. So thanks for coming.